Behind them lies an unforgiving war, and ahead, the consequences for those who chose the wrong side. For Draco, the fight is not over. The Malfoy Manor is his inheritance, and he will not allow himself to lose it because of one mistake. The rain in Wiltshire did not cleanse, it drowned. It was a relentless grey curtain that turned the world into a blurred watercolour of sorrow and mud. Hermione Granger stood before the wrought iron gates of Malfoy Manor, the water soaking through the shoulders of her heavy travelling cloak, chilling her skin, though the cold she felt had nothing to do with the weather. In her pocket, shielded by an impervious charm, lay a roll of parchment stamped with the crimson wax of the Ministry of Magic. The deed, the assignment of property, the restitution order, legal terms that sounded sterile and triumphant in a courtroom, but felt heavy, like a stone, here in the silence of the countryside. She was the owner. The words tasted like ash on her tongue. Hermione tightened her grip on the handle of her beaded bag. The magic of the gates hummed against her presence, a low, vibrating frequency that set her teeth on edge. The wards knew she didn't belong here. The ancient magic of the Malfoy bloodline, woven into the very soil for centuries, recognized her not as a mistress, but as an invader, an anomaly, a mudblood standing where only pure blood was meant to tread. She took a breath, inhaling the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. "I am not afraid," she whispered, though the lie was fragile. She wasn't afraid of Voldemort anymore. He was dust. She wasn't afraid of Bellatrix Lestrange. She was a nightmare laid to rest. But this place? This towering silhouette of dark stone cutting against the stormy sky? This place remembered her screams. She raised her wand, the movement stiff. She didn't want to blast the gates open. That would be an act of war, and the war was supposed to be over. She simply tapped the metal, once, twice, thrice. A hollow, metallic clang rang out, swallowed almost instantly by the wind. For a long time, nothing happened. Hermione waited. She would not leave. She had promised Kingsley. The confiscation of dark estates was a political necessity, a way to broach the financial spine of the old regime, but assigning Malfoy Manor to Hermione Granger was something else. It was a symbol. It was the Ministry saying, "Look how the world has turned." A figure detached itself from the gloom of the long driveway. At first, he was just a smudge of black against the grey, a shadow moving through the rain without seeming to disturb it. As he drew closer, the details sharpened, like a photograph developing in acid. Draco Malfoy. He wore no cloak, only a black suit that hung too loosely on his frame, the fine fabric soaked through, plastering the white shirt underneath to his chest. His hair, once gelled back in immaculate arrogance, was longer now, falling in wet silver strands across his forehead. He looked like a ghost who had forgotten how to haunt. He stopped 10 feet from the gate. The iron bars stood between them, black teeth in a jagged mouth. He didn't speak. He just looked at her. Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. She had expected anger. She had expected a sneer, a curse, a shouted eviction. She had prepared for fire. She was not prepared for this dead, hollow silence. His eyes were grey, but not the storm cloud grey she remembered from school. They were the colour of stagnant water, dull, flat, exhausted. "The Ministry sent an owl," she said, her voice fighting the sound of the rain. "You knew I was coming." Draco blinked, a a slow, languid movement, as if the effort cost him something. "I assumed," he said, his voice rough, unused. "I assumed it was a joke, a final bureaucratic punchline." "It's not a joke, Malfoy." "No." He looked at the parchment shape in her pocket, then back to her face. His gaze lingered for a split second on her neck, then drifted away. "It's a punishment for both of us. I am here to take possession of the property," Hermione stated, falling back on the safety of formal language. It was her armor under the Reparations Act of 1998. You are permitted to remain, pending the review of the darker artifacts, as a custodian of the family history. But the ownership transfers today." Draco let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so devoid of humor. He stepped closer to the gate. His hands, pale and long-fingered, gripped the wet iron. He didn't seem to notice the cold. "Possession," he murmured, tasting the word. "You think you can possess this, Granger?" He tilted his head back slightly, indicating the sprawling, monstrous estate behind him. "It breathes, it hates, it remembers. I can handle a house, Malfoy." "It's not a house," he said softly, his eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, terrifying intensity. "It's a graveyard, and you're walking right into the open grave." He stared at her, challenging her, daring her to turn around and run back to the warmth of the burrow, back to the world of heroes and sunlight. Hermione felt the urge to do exactly that. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she thought of the scar on her arm hidden beneath her sleeve. Mud blood. If she ran now, the word won. "Open the gate, Draco," she said. The use of his given name seemed to shock the air between them. His eyes narrowed. A flicker of something, pain, irritation, crossed his face. Slowly, agonizingly, he drew his wand. It was not the hawthorn wand. That was gone. This was plain, dark wood. He waved it casually, a gesture of surrender that felt more like an insult. The lock groaned. The heavy chains rattled and fell away like dead snakes. The gates swung inward with a shriek of rusted hinges that sounded like a woman screaming. Hermione flinched. She couldn't help it. Draco saw it. A corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile, but a grim acknowledgement of her fear. He stepped back, sweeping his arm in a mock bow, welcoming her into hell. "Welcome home, Granger," he whispered. Hermione stepped across the threshold. The moment her boot hit the gravel of the driveway, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, denser, pressing against her eardrums. The scent of rain was replaced by the smell of ozone and ancient stone. The manor loomed ahead, a dark stain on the horizon. The windows were dark, save for a single flicker of candlelight in the upper west wing. She walked up the long drive, Draco falling into step beside her, though he kept a deliberate distance. He didn't offer to carry her bag. He didn't cast a drying charm on her. He simply walked, a silent wraith escorting her to the gallows. "The elves?" she asked, breaking the oppressive silence. "Gone," Draco answered, staring straight ahead. "Freed. Or fled. I didn't ask." "So, you're alone here?" "I am never alone," he said cryptically. "The portraits talk, usually to scream insults at me. The floorboards creak with footsteps that aren't there. It's quite lively, really." The sarcasm was brittle, like dried glass. They reached the massive oak front doors. They were scarred, scratches marring the dark wood, remnants of the snatchers, or perhaps the dark creatures Voldemort had allowed to roam the halls. Draco didn't use magic this time. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the physical exertion making him grunt softly. The entrance hall was a cavern of shadows. The grand chandelier, once a cascading waterfall of crystal, was dim and dusty, covered in cobwebs that swayed in the draught from the open door. The black and white marble floor, which Hermione remembered shining like a mirror, was dull and scuffed. It was cold, colder than outside. It was a damp, creeping cold that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. Hermione shivered, pulling her cloak tighter. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was magnificent and hideous. It was a palace of rot. "The guest wing is habitable," Draco said, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. He didn't look at her. He was looking at a spot on the floor near the drawing room doors. Hermione knew that spot. She knew what had happened there. She felt bile rise in her throat. "I won't be staying in the guest wing," she said, her voice too loud. "I will be taking the master suite." She didn't want the master suite. The thought of sleeping in Lucius Malfoy's bed made her skin crawl. But she had to establish dominance. She had to show the house and him that the hierarchy had flipped. Draco turned to her slowly. For the first time, a spark of genuine emotion flared in his eyes. Anger. Hot, white, sudden anger. "The master suite," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want my father's room?" "I want the room that belongs to the owner of the house, according to the deed." "Burn the deed," he hissed, taking a step toward her. The lethargy vanished, replaced by the coiled tension of a cornered animal. "Paper means nothing here. Magic is what rules this house. Blood is what rules this house." "Your blood lost," Hermione snapped, the adrenaline finally overriding her fear. She stepped into his space, tilting her head back to look him in the eye. "Your blood spilled innocent blood on this floor. You don't get to dictate terms anymore, Draco. You lost. Do you understand? You lost everything." The words hung in the air, cruel and true. Draco froze. His face went deathly pale, the grey eyes widening slightly. He looked at her as if she had struck him. For a moment she thought he might curse her. His hand twitched toward his wand. But then the fire went out. The anger drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving behind that terrifying, empty exhaustion. His shoulders slumped. He looked away, staring into the darkness of the corridor. "Yes," he said softly. "I know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of keys. They were iron, ancient and rusted. He held them out to her, but he didn't look at her. He couldn't. "The big one is for the master suite," he said, his voice void of inflection. "The silver one is for the library. The jagged one. Don't use the jagged one." Hermione reached out. Her fingers brushed his palm as she took the keys. His skin was ice cold. He flinched at the contact, snatching his hand back as if she had burned him. The keys jangled in her grasp, a discordant song of victory that felt entirely like defeat. "I will be in the servants' quarters in the attic," Draco said, turning his back on her. "If you need anything, don't ask." "Draco," she called out as he began to walk away into the shadows. He stopped, but didn't turn. "We start the inventory tomorrow at dawn. Be ready." He didn't answer. He simply merged with the darkness of the hallway, his footsteps silent on the marble, leaving Hermione standing alone in the center of the cold, dead hall. She looked down at the keys in her hand. They felt heavy, dragging her hand down. She looked up at the grand staircase, spiraling up into the gloom. The house groaned, timber settling somewhere deep in the structure. It sounded like a growl. Hermione Granger tightened her grip on the iron keys until her knuckles turned white. She was the mistress of Malfoy Manor now. She had never felt more like a prisoner. The morning sun did not break through the clouds over Wiltshire. It merely bruised them, turning the sky a mottled, sickly violet. Inside the manor, the dawn was nothing more than a shifting of shadows, a grey, dilute light that crept reluctantly across the cold stone floors. Hermione Granger had not slept. The master suite, with its four-poster bed draped in heavy emerald velvet and silver brocade, had felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sarcophagus. Every time she closed her eyes, the silence of the house amplified, transforming into a roar of phantom whispers. She had spent the night sitting in a high-backed armchair by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, her wand gripped tightly in her hand. Now she stood before a set of double doors on the ground floor. They were tall, imposing slabs of dark mahogany, polished to a mirror shine that reflected her distorted silhouette. She wore her crisp ministry robes, navy blue, high-collared, practical. They were her armor. She had pinned her hair back severely, pulling the skin tight at her temples, needing the sharpness of the sensation to ground her. This was the drawing room. On the parchment checklist floating beside her, item number 4 read simply, South Wing Reception Area, Drawing Room. Inspect for dark arts residue and structural integrity. It was a bureaucratic lie. This wasn't a reception area. It was an abattoir. Hermione's hand hovered over the brass handle. Her fingers trembled. Just a tremor, barely visible, but she felt it vibrate up her arm, settling as a cold knot in her chest. "It's just a room," she whispered, the words sounding tinny and foolish in the empty corridor. "It is wood and stone and magic, nothing else." She pushed the doors open. The smell hit her first. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood that had been scrubbed away years ago. It was the smell of lavender polish, old wax, and something cloying and sweet, like dying lilies. It was the scent of preservation. The room had been kept perfectly, frozen in time, a museum of horrors. She stepped inside. Her heels clicked on the parquet floor, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The space was cavernous. The crystal chandelier hung overhead, a constellation of frozen tears. The fireplace, vast enough to roast a whole stag, was dark and cold, its maw gaping open. And there, in the center of the room, lay the Persian rug. The rug. Hermione's breath hitched. Her vision blurred at the edges. The room seemed to tilt. The navy blue of her robes faded, replaced by the memory of denim and a pink jumper. She wasn't standing. She was falling. She was on her back. The ceiling was spinning. "What did you take? What else did you take?" The voice screeched in her mind, high and jagged, tearing through the logical barriers she had erected. Bellatrix. Hermione stumbled, her hand flying out to catch the edge of a marble console table. The cold stone bit into her palm. She gasped for air, but the air was thin, insufficient. Her left arm began to burn. The scar, mud blood, etched into her flesh, throbbed with a phantom heat, searing as if the cursed knife were carving it anew right now, in this second. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to occlude, trying to find the calm white room in her mind that Harry had tried to teach her about, that she had read about in dusty tomes. But there was no white room. There was only the red haze of pain and the sound of her own screaming echoing off these very walls. "Stop it!" she hissed through gritted teeth. "Stop it! Stop it!" She slid down the leg of the table, her knees hitting the floor. The indignity of it didn't matter. She couldn't stand. The floor beneath her felt sticky, though she knew it was dry. She curled in on herself, pressing her forehead against the cold wood of the table leg, her breathing coming in short, ragged gasps that sounded like tearing paper. She was the war heroine. She was the brightest witch of her age. She was the new owner of this castle. And she was a terrified girl crying on the floor where she had been tortured. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't hear the footsteps, soft, deliberate, approach her. "Breathe, Granger. Unless you intend to suffocate on my carpet, that would be a bureaucratic nightmare to clean up." The voice was cool, detached, and utterly devoid of pity. Hermione's head snapped up. Draco Malfoy was leaning against the frame of the open door, arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing the same black suit as the day before, though the shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the sharp line of his throat and the pale skin that looked like it hadn't seen the sun in years. He wasn't looking at her with malice. He wasn't sneering. He was watching her with a strange, clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Hermione scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the rug, her back hitting the leg of a sofa. She wiped her face frantically, hating the wetness on her cheeks, hating that he was seeing this. Of all the people in the world, he was the last one who should see her break. "Get out," she croaked, her voice shaking. "Get out, Malfoy." "I live here," he replied simply. He didn't move. "And you are currently hyperventilating in my drawing room. Technically, you are the intruder in this particular memory." "I am not." She tried to stand, but her legs were water. She slumped back, glaring at him with wet, furious eyes. "I am inspecting the property." "You are inspecting the ghosts," he corrected. He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room. Hermione flinched, her hand instinctively going to her wand. Draco stopped 5 feet away. He saw the movement, the fear in her eyes, and he paused. He didn't raise his hands in surrender, but he stopped advancing. He looked around the room, his gaze drifting over the chandelier, the fireplace, the spot on the floor where she sat. His expression was unreadable, a mask of porcelain stillness. "Do you think you are the only one who hears them?" he asked quietly. Hermione stared at him. The burning in her arm receded slightly, replaced by a cold confusion. "What?" "The screams," Draco said. He looked at the chandelier above them. "My aunt had a piercing voice. It lingers in the acoustics. On quiet nights when the wind dies down, I can hear her laughing. I can hear you screaming. I can hear the goblin choking." He looked back down at her. His grey eyes were dark, almost black in the dim light. There was no mockery there. There was only a profound, hollow exhaustion. "I stood right there." He pointed to a spot near the fireplace. "I stood there, and I watched. I watched you bleed on this floor. I watched my mother look away. I watched my father terrified of a mad woman." Hermione's breath caught. She had never thought about where he was. In her memory, he was just a blur of pale hair and fear, a peripheral shadow while the pain consumed her. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you are trying to conquer this room with a clipboard and a deed," Draco said, his voice dropping to a harsh murmur. "You think if you own the stones, you own the memory. You don't. The memory owns us." He took a step closer. The tension in the room spiked. It wasn't the tension of a duel. It was the tension of two drowning people realizing they're in the same ocean. "You're shaking," he observed. "I'm fine." "You're lying. You're pathetic." "Don't you dare." "You're pathetic because you think you have to be strong here." He cut her off, his voice rising slightly, a crack of emotion breaking through the ice. "You think you can just walk in here and tidy up the trauma. You can't. This room is a wound, Granger. It doesn't heal. It just scabs over, and you just rip the scab off." Hermione stared at him, her chest heaving. She wanted to hex him. She wanted to scream at him for his arrogance, for his complicity. But looking at him now, at the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his own hands that he hid by clenching them into fists, she realized something devastating. He wasn't taunting her. He was validating her. He was the only other person on Earth who knew exactly what the air in this room tasted like. Harry and Ron knew the story, but they didn't know the smell. They didn't know the specific quality of the light as it hit the crystal while she writhed on the floor. Draco knew. "I hate this place," she whispered. The confession tumbled out before she could stop it. "So do I," Draco replied instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer sharp. It was a shared weight. Draco sighed, a sound that seemed to scrape against his ribs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and took a long swallow, his throat working. Then, hesitantly, he held it out to her. Hermione looked at the flask. It was engraved with the Malfoy crest, the serpents intertwined. It was a symbol of everything she fought against. She looked up at his face. He was looking away towards the window, giving her the dignity of choice. Slowly, her hand shaking, she reached out and took the flask. Their fingers did not touch. The metal was warm from his body. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. Fire whiskey. It burned her throat, hot and fierce, chasing away the phantom cold of the Cruciatus curse. She coughed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She handed the flask back. "Better?" he asked, still looking at the window. "No," she said honestly. "Good." He capped the flask and slipped it back into his pocket. "If you felt better, you'd be insane." He turned to look at her then. For a second, the mask slipped entirely. She saw a boy who had been forced to grow up in a house of monsters, who had been broken by the same darkness that had scarred her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not kindness, certainly not affection, but recognition, a grim acknowledgement of a fellow survivor. "Get up, Granger," he said. It wasn't an order, it was a challenge. Hermione placed her palms flat on the floor. She pushed. Her muscles protested. Her legs felt weak, but she rose. She swayed slightly, and for a heartbeat, she thought Draco might reach out to steady her. His hand twitched at his side, but he didn't. He stayed rooted to his spot, respecting the line she had drawn in the sand. He let her find her own balance. She smoothed her robes, her fingers brushing the dust from the navy fabric. She took a deep breath, the fire whiskey curling in her stomach, grounding her. "I need to catalogue the artifacts on the mantel," she said, her voice stronger now, "and check the chimney for dark wards." Draco nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. "The chimney is clear. The artifacts are mostly cursed. Don't touch the onyx skull without dragonhide gloves. It bites." "I have gloves," she said automatically. "Of course you do." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. He turned and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at her standing in the center of the room, small but upright beneath the crushing weight of the chandelier. "Granger," he said. She looked at him, her guard raising again. "You don't have to come back in here alone," he said. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and disappeared into the shadowed hallway, his footsteps silent, leaving her alone with the silence. But the silence was different now. It was no longer screaming. It was just quiet. Hermione looked down at the spot on the rug. The phantom blood was gone. It was just a rug, a hideously expensive old rug. She pulled her dragonhide gloves from her pocket, pulled them on with a snap of leather, and walked toward the mantel. The panic was still there, a coiled snake in her gut, but the paralysis had broken. She wasn't just a victim here anymore, and he wasn't just a monster. They were just two ghosts haunting the same castle, trying to survive the wreckage. She picked up the onyx skull. It snapped its jaws at her thumb. "Oh, shut up," she muttered, and placed it into the containment box. The library of Malfoy Manor was not a place for reading. It was a place for drowning. It was a cathedral of silence, a cavernous hall where the shelves rose 3 stories high, disappearing into the gloom of the vaulted ceiling. The air here was different, drier, sharper, tasting of decomposing vellum, iron gall ink, and the metallic tang of dormant curses. It was a tomb of knowledge that the Ministry of Magic wanted excavated, catalogued, and, in most cases, incinerated. Hermione Granger stood at a massive oak table in the center of the room, surrounded by towers of books she had pulled from the restricted section. It was the 3rd day of the inventory. The silence between her and Draco Malfoy had shifted from the icy hostility of the gates to a thick, suffocating tension that filled the room like smoke. "Item 402, Hermione said, her voice scratching against the quiet. She didn't look up from her parchment. "Treatise on the Nightshade Poisons, 17th century, heavily annotated, Class B dark artifact, to be confiscated." "It's not a weapon, Granger. It's a medicinal guide." The voice came from the top of a rolling ladder 10 feet away. Draco was perched there, shrouded in shadow, a book resting on his knee. He looked like a gargoyle carved from marble and resentment. "It details how to liquefy a lung in 30 seconds, Hermione countered, dipping her quill into the inkwell with a sharp clink. "That falls under weaponized alchemy. Box it." "It also details the only known countercurse for basilisk venom, aside from phoenix tears," Draco argued, his tone bored but biting. He slammed the book shut, a sound like a gunshot, and slid down the ladder with a fluid, practiced grace. "But by all means, burn it. Let the next poor sod who gets bitten die because you were offended by the author's tone." He walked toward the table, carrying a stack of leather-bound volumes. He dumped them onto the wood, a cloud of dust puffing up between them. Hermione waved it away, coughing. "I am following the Ministry guidelines, Malfoy. Any object capable of inflicting fatal harm without countermeasure is to be seized." "Everything in this room is capable of inflicting harm," Draco murmured, leaning against the table edge, too close. He was rolling up his shirt sleeves, exposing the pale skin of his forearms. The dark mark was faded, a silver scar against the white, but Hermione's eyes snagged on it involuntarily. He saw her look. He didn't cover it. He just stared at her, challenging her disgust. "If you drop that quill with enough force, it's a weapon. Are you going to confiscate your own stationery? Don't be absurd. I'm being practical. You're stripping the history out of this house until it's just a shell. It's a history of violence, she snapped, looking up at him finally. Her eyes met his grey ones, and the jolt of contact was visceral. They were tired, both of them. There were dark smudges under her eyes that mirrored his. They were two scholars trapped in a cage of paper. It's still history, he said, softer this time. He reached out and pulled the Nightshade treatise from the confiscate pile. He opened it to a specific page, his long fingers tracing a diagram of a complex brewing structure. My great-grandfather used this to cure a dragonpox outbreak in the village in 1912. The ministry gave him an Order of Merlin for it. Then they took it back when his son supported Grindelwald. The magic didn't change Granger. The politics did. Hermione looked at the diagram. The runes were complex, archaic. She recognized the arithmancy structure instantly. It was brilliant. Dangerous, yes, but brilliant. She bit her lip, her intellectual curiosity warring with her orders. Fine, she conceded, the word feeling like a stone in her throat. Restricted access, kept on site, but sealed with a blood ward so it can't be removed. Draco's mouth quirked. It wasn't a smile, but the tension in his jaw relaxed. A compromise. How very un-Gryffindor of you. I'm tired, Malfoy. Don't push your luck. They worked in silence for the next hour. The sun began to set, the grey light in the high windows turning to a bruised purple, then fading into black. The library grew darker, the shadows stretching out like long fingers. Hermione lit the candelabras on the table with a flick of her wand. The golden light created a small, intimate island in the sea of darkness. The proximity was becoming a problem. As they categorized the smaller artifacts, silver instruments, cursed opals, boxes of hummed whispers, they fell into a rhythm. Hermione would pick up an object, cast a diagnostic charm, and hesitate over the translation of the engraving. Draco, without looking up from his own pile, would murmur the correct translation or the historical context. It's 15th century goblin silver, he said, when she frowned at a jagged dagger. Don't touch the blade. It causes eternal bleeding. I know what a Morgul blade looks like, she muttered, but she shifted her grip carefully. Clearly not. You were holding it by the crossguard. The curse travels up the metal. I was wearing gloves. Gloves don't stop intent-based magic. Why do you know so much about intent-based magic? Why do you know so little? It was a dance, a sharp, intellectual fencing match where the blades were facts and the parries were corrections. And despite herself, Hermione felt a grudging respect unfurling in her chest. He was brilliant. She had always known he was intelligent. He was second in their year after all. But this was different. This wasn't schoolbook memorization. This was a deep, intuitive understanding of the dark and grey areas of magic that she had always been taught to fear. He didn't fear it. He understood it. He respected it. They reached for the same object at the same time. It was a celestial globe, a delicate sphere of spun glass and orbiting gold rings resting on a velvet cushion. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, swirling with a trapped nebula of blue smoke. Hermione's hand hovered over the left side. Draco's hand hovered over the right. They stopped inches from the glass and inches from each other. The sphere of lost time, Draco whispered. His voice was low, vibrating in the quiet space. "It shows you the path not taken." Hermione stared at the swirling smoke. "It's illegal. Chronomancy is strictly regulated." "It's not time travel," he corrected, his eyes fixed on the glass. "It's a projection, a what-if. It's harmless, mostly, unless you get lost in it. We should box it. Look at it, Granger." She looked. The smoke inside the sphere shifted. She saw a flash of an image, a crowded room, laughter, a version of herself with softer hair and no scar on her arm. She saw herself laughing at something Ron said. But then the image twisted. She saw herself alone in a ministry office, buried under paperwork, old and bitter. She blinked, shaking her head. "It's a distraction." "It's a mirror," Draco said. He moved his hand to rotate the rings. Hermione moved her hand to stop him. Their fingers brushed. The contact was electric. A spark, literal and stinging, jumped between their skin. Hermione gasped and jerked her hand back. Draco froze, his fingers curled in the air where her hand had been a second ago. The silence that followed was absolute. The library seemed to hold its breath. Hermione looked at him. He was staring at his own hand, then he slowly lifted his gaze to hers. The candlelight flickered in his eyes, turning the grey to liquid silver. There was no sneer now, no arrogance, just a raw, exposed intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. He was close, so close she could smell him. Parchment, expensive soap, and the rain that always seemed to cling to him. She could see the faint pulse in his neck. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The enmity, the war, the mudblood slur, the torture, the years of hatred hung suspended between them, fragile as the glass sphere. In this light, stripped of their titles and their sides, they were just a man and a woman alone in the dark. "You have ink on your cheek," Draco said softly. The banality of the sentence shattered the moment, but the tone did not. It was intimate, uncomfortably so. Hermione flustered, her hand flying to her face, scrubbing at her skin. I do. Left side." He watched her struggle, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh that sounded like defeat, he reached out. Hermione stopped breathing. He didn't touch her skin. He stopped a hair's breadth away, his thumb hovering near her cheekbone. The heat radiating from his finger was palpable. He looked at the spot, then looked into her eyes. The air between them crackled, thick and heavy, charged with a magnetism that terrified her. He could lean in. The thought flashed through her mind, unbidden, shocking. He could lean in, and she wasn't sure if she would hex him or... Draco pulled his hand back slowly, clenching it into a fist at his side. He stepped back, putting the table between them again. The distance felt cold. "It's gone now," he said, his voice rough. Hermione let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her legs felt weak. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Right. Thank you." "We should finish," Draco said, turning abruptly away from her, grabbing a stack of books with unnecessary force. "The inspector is coming tomorrow. If this mess isn't cleared, they'll fine you." "Fine me?" Hermione blinked, trying to regain her composure. "I'm the owner." "Exactly." Draco threw over his shoulder, his back to her. "Heavy is the head that wears the crown, Granger. Or, in your case, holds the deed." He was putting the walls back up. Brick by brick, stone by stone, he was retreating into the safety of sarcasm and distance. But it was too late. Hermione had seen behind the wall. She had felt the heat. She looked at his back, at the tension in his shoulders. She looked at the sphere of lost time, swirling silently on the table. "Draco," she said. He paused, a book suspended in mid-air. He didn't turn. "The treatise on Nightshade," she said quietly. "Put it in the keep pile. You can annotate the counter-curse for the Ministry records. It would be valuable." Draco stood still for a long moment. Then he lowered the book he was holding. He didn't say thank you. He didn't acknowledge the concession with words. "We have 3 more rows," he said, his voice steady again, the mask back in place. "Try to keep up." But as he walked into the shadows of the stacks, Hermione saw him touch the spot on his thumb where their hands had almost touched. He rubbed it against his palm as if the spark was still burning him. Hermione turned back to her parchment. Her handwriting was shaky. Item 403, Sphere of Lost Time. Status, retained. She realized with a jolt of panic that she wasn't writing about the artifacts anymore. She was writing about him. The library was no longer just a room of dust and paper. It was a battlefield where the lines were blurring, and the enemy was becoming something much more dangerous, human. And she had a terrifying feeling that the inspection tomorrow would shatter this fragile, terrifying truce into 1,000,000 pieces. The peace of the library was shattered, not by magic, but by a fist pounding on the front door. It was mid-morning. The grey light of Wiltshire had brightened into a hesitant, watery, pale yellow. Hermione was in the entrance hall, her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dust on her cheek, when the heavy oak vibrated with the impact. Draco, who had been coming down the stairs carrying a stack of linens from the linen closet, a mundane domestic task that looked jarringly wrong on him, froze. His face tightened. The weary camaraderie that had begun to sprout in the library instantly withered, replaced by the mask of the prisoner. "The Ministry," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. Hermione checked her watch. "Inspector Pringle, he's early." She moved toward the door. Draco didn't follow. He retreated, stepping back into the shadow of the staircase, making himself small, making himself invisible. It was a learned reflex, she realized with a pang of pity. In the months since the trials, visibility meant danger. Hermione opened the door. Barnaby Pringle was a short, thick-set man in lime-green robes that clashed violently with the sombre stone of the manor. He smelled of stale tobacco and cheap cologne. He didn't wait to be invited. He bustled past her, his eyes darting greedily around the grand foyer like a niffler in a jewelry shop. "Miss Granger," he boomed, his voice echoing unpleasantly. "Right on time, eh? Thought I'd catch you before lunch. Get the unpleasantness out of the way." "Mr. Pringle," Hermione said coolly, closing the door against the draft. "We weren't expecting you until noon. The inventory isn't fully categorized." Details. Pringle waved a hand dismissively. He walked to the center of the hall, his boots leaving muddy prints on the marble. Prints Hermione knew Draco would likely scrub away later in silence. Pringle spun around, taking in the chandelier, the tapestries, the sheer scale of the wealth. "Merlin, it's a gloomy pit, isn't it? Smells like dark magic and rot, but the Ministry will strip it clean soon enough. The auction boys are salivating over the silver." Hermione stiffened. "The silver is currently under review for historical preservation." "Preservation?" Pringle snorted. He walked over to a delicate console table and picked up a porcelain vase, tossing it casually in the air and catching it. Hermione winced. "It's traitor gold, Granger. We melt it down, pay for the war, and pave the streets with the rest. That's justice." He turned, and his eyes landed on the shadows beneath the stairs. "And speaking of trash," Pringle sneered. Draco stepped forward. He had composed himself. His face was blank, his posture rigid. He held the linens against his chest like a shield. "Inspector," Draco said, his voice devoid of tone. "Malfoy." Pringle spat the name like a curse. He walked over to Draco, invading his personal space. Pringle was shorter, but he carried the weight of the victor. He looked Draco up and down with undisguised contempt. "Still here? I thought we'd have shipped you off to Azkaban by now for sneezing wrong." Draco didn't flinch. He looked at a point over Pringle's shoulder. "I am compliant with the terms of my probation." "Compliant," Pringle mocked, reaching out and flicking the high collar of Draco's shirt. Draco's jaw muscle jumped, but he didn't move. "Look at you, Lord of the Manor. Now you're just the help, aren't you? Folding sheets like a house elf. Maybe we should get you a tea towel toga." Hermione felt a flash of heat in her chest. It wasn't the righteous anger of the courtroom. It was something sharper, more protective. "Mr. Pringle," she warned, her voice dropping an octave. Pringle ignored her. He was enjoying himself. He reached out and shoved the stack of linens in Draco's arms, knocking them to the dusty floor. The white sheets spilled out, dirtying instantly on the mud Pringle had tracked in. "Oops," Pringle grinned, his teeth yellow. "Clumsy. Pick it up, Death Eater." Draco stared at the sheets. For a second, Hermione saw the humiliation burn in his eyes, raw and agonizing. He was a Malfoy. He was proud, arrogant, difficult. But he was being kicked while he was down, stripped of dignity in his own home. Slowly, Draco bent his knees to crouch. "Don't," Hermione said. The word cracked through the hall like a whip. Draco froze halfway to the floor. Pringle turned to look at her, blinking in confusion. "Excuse me?" Pringle asked. "I said, don't," Hermione repeated. She walked forward, her heels clicking rhythmically, deadly steady. She didn't look at Draco. She looked straight at Pringle. "Do not pick them up, Draco." She stopped between the two men, placing herself deliberately in Pringle's line of sight, shielding Draco with her body. She drew herself up to her full height. She was Hermione Granger, war heroine, brightest witch of her age, and currently the lady of this house. "Mr. Pringle," she said, her voice ice-cold and dangerously calm. "You are here to inspect Class C artifacts. You are not here to harass the custodian, and you are certainly not here to treat this house like a rubbish tip." Pringle's face reddened. "Now look here, Granger. I'm a senior ministry official. You can't talk to me like—" "I am the legal owner of Malfoy Manor." Hermione cut him off, stepping closer. She saw Pringle flinch. "This is my house. These are my linens, and that man is my responsibility. If you disrespect him, you disrespect me. And if you disrespect me, I will file a formal complaint with Minister Shacklebolt detailing your unprofessional conduct, your damage to ministry property." She pointed to the muddy footprints. "And your harassment of a probationary citizen." The silence that followed was absolute. Pringle opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Hermione's furious eyes, then at her hand, which was hovering inches from her wand. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the Granger in front of him wasn't just a bureaucrat. She was the woman who had helped bring down the Dark Lord. I was just joking, Pringle muttered, backing away. Testing his reflexes. Standard procedure. Get out, Hermione said. But the inspection... Reschedule it, she snapped. She flicked her wand. The front door flew open with a bang, wind and rain swirling into the hall. Get off my property, now. Pringle scrambled. He clutched his briefcase to his chest and scuttled backward, nearly tripping over the threshold in his haste to escape the witch's wrath. He disappeared into the rain without another word. Hermione waved her wand again. The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. The silence returned, but it was vibrating now. The air felt thin, charged with adrenaline. Hermione stood there, breathing hard, her hands trembling slightly. She stared at the closed door, processing what she had just done. She had defended a Malfoy. She had called this place her house. Behind her there was a rustle of fabric. She turned. Draco was standing amidst the spilled sheets. He wasn't looking at the floor anymore. He was looking at her. His expression was shattered. The mask was gone entirely. His eyes were wide, unguarded, filled with a mixture of shock and something that looked terrifyingly like awe. He looked as if he had never seen her before. Not really. You sent him away, he said. His voice was a whisper, rough with disbelief. He's a senior inspector. He could make your life difficult. He was a bully, Hermione said, her voice shaking. I don't tolerate bullies. I don't care who they work for. He was right, though, Draco said bitterly. I am a Death Eater. I am the help. You are a human being, Hermione said fiercely. She took a step toward him. And as long as you are under this roof, you will be treated with dignity. I won't have it, Malfoy. I won't have this war continue in my hallway. Draco stared at her. His throat worked as he swallowed. He looked down at the sheets, then back up at her face. The hostility that had defined their relationship for 7 years, the wall of us versus them, had developed a crack so wide she could see the soul beneath it. Why? He asked. After everything I did to you, why? Because, Hermione said softly, the anger draining out of her, leaving only a tired honesty. Because the war is over, Draco. Someone has to stop fighting. She used his first name again. This time he didn't flinch. He looked at her for a long moment, searching for a lie, a trick. When he found none, his shoulders sagged. The tension that held him upright seemed to dissolve, leaving him looking younger and infinitely sadder. Slowly, he knelt on the marble. Hermione moved to help him, but he held up a hand. No, he said quietly. Let me. It wasn't a submission this time. It was a choice. He gathered the linens with care, shaking off the dust, folding them with precise, steady hands. Hermione watched him. She saw the elegance in his movements, the pride that refused to be extinguished even in servitude. When he stood up, he didn't retreat into the shadows. He stood his ground, holding the stack of white cloth. Thank you, he said. The words were stiff, foreign on his tongue, but they were sincere. You're welcome, Hermione replied. He hesitated, then took a step closer to her. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. The air was no longer cold. It was warm, intimate. The smell of the rain Pringle had let in mixed with the scent of the old house. He touched Narcissa's vase, Draco murmured, looking at the console table. I thought he was going to break it. He won't touch it again, Hermione promised. I'll ward the personal items, Only you and I will be able to move them. You and I. The phrase hung in the air. A team. A unit. Draco looked at her, and for the first time, a faint, genuine smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. They were still too haunted, but it was there. A peace offering. "You're terrifying when you're angry, Granger," he said softly. "I've been told," she smiled back, a small, tired smile. "I think—" Draco paused, shifting the linens. "I think there is a bottle of elf-made wine in the cellar that the Ministry missed. 1895. It breathes better than fire whiskey." It was an invitation. Tentative, fragile, but undeniable. Hermione looked at the staircase, then at the empty, lonely hall, and finally at the grey-eyed boy who was offering her the only thing he had left to give, his company. "I think," Hermione said, meeting his gaze, "that I could use a glass." Draco nodded. He turned toward the kitchen, and this time he didn't walk like a ghost. He walked like a man who had just been given permission to exist. Hermione watched him go, feeling the strange, shifting tectonic plates of her heart. She had come here to dismantle the Malfoy legacy. She hadn't expected to start rebuilding the Malfoy heir. As she followed him into the depths of the manor, the shadows didn't seem quite so dark. The storm did not arrive. It assaulted them. It began as a low pressure in the ears, a static charge that made the hair on Hermione's arms stand on end. Then, the sky above Wiltshire cracked open. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge of ancient, angry water, accompanied by thunder that shook the very foundations of the earth. They were in the West Wing, a smaller, more secluded section of the manor that Draco had claimed was structurally sound, though Hermione suspected he simply preferred it because it was far away from the drawing room. They had just opened the bottle of 1895 elf-made wine when the first bolt of lightning struck the protective wards. Crack. The sound was deafening, like a dragon screaming in agony. The manor groaned, a deep tectonic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The wards!" Hermione gasped, reaching for her wand. "They're overloading." "Leave it," Draco ordered, his voice calm but strained. He was standing by the window, watching the violet arcs of magic collide with the invisible dome over the estate. The manor absorbs ambient magic during storms. If you cast a stabilizing charm now, it will backfire and blow the roof off. "So we just wait?" "We wait." As if to punctuate his sentence, the magical lights in the sconces flickered, once, twice, and died. The room plunged into absolute darkness. "Lumos," Hermione said instinctively. A weak spark fizzled at the tip of her wand and vanished. "I told you." Draco's voice came from the dark, dry and close. "The manor is hungry. It's draining everything. No wands until the storm passes." Blindness. Complete, suffocating blackness. Hermione felt a spike of panic. The darkness here wasn't empty. It was heavy. It felt like the inside of a coffin. She took a step back, her hand searching for the back of the sofa, needing an anchor. "Stay there," Draco said. She heard the scratch of a match, a sound so mundane it was startling. A small flame flared to life, illuminating Draco's face. He was cupping the flame, the orange light carving deep shadows into his cheekbones and hollows of his eyes. He looked severe, beautiful, and utterly lost. He lit a candelabra on the low table between two velvet armchairs. 3 flames danced, pushing the darkness back into the corners of the room. It wasn't much light, but it turned the space into a golden, intimate sphere, cut off from the rest of the world. Sit, Draco said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. He poured the wine. The liquid was dark as blood in the glass. Hermione sat. The storm outside howled, wind battering the glass like fists demanding entry. But inside this small circle of candlelight, the air was still. She took the glass he offered. Their fingers didn't touch this time, but the heat of his hand lingered on the crystal. She took a sip. It was complex. Notes of blackberries, smoke, and something metallic, like iron. It tastes like... She hesitated. Regret, Draco suggested. He sank into his own chair, stretching his long legs out, crossing them at the ankles. He loosened his tie, pulling it free and tossing it onto the floor. It was a gesture of dismantling, of shedding the armor he wore for the world. I was going to say history, Hermione corrected softly. Same thing in this house. He drank deeply, closing his eyes as the wine hit his throat. Hermione watched him. In the flickering light, the harsh lines of his face softened. The arrogance that usually held his features together melted away, leaving behind a young man who looked incredibly tired. Why do you fight for it, Draco? The questions slipped out before she could weigh it. The wine, the storm, the isolation. It stripped away the polite fiction of their arrangement. Draco opened his eyes. He swirled the wine in his glass, mesmerizingly slow. Fight for what? This place, the manor. You said it's a graveyard. You said it hates you. Why are you fighting the ministry so hard to keep it? Why not just let it go? Start over somewhere else? Somewhere without ghosts. Draco stared into the fire of the candle. A flash of lightning illuminated the room for a split second, turning his face stark white before the gloom rushed back in. Because I don't exist anywhere else, he said. The admission was so quiet, so devoid of self-pity, that it broke Hermione's heart a little. That's not true, she argued weakly. You have a life. I have a name that is a curse, he interrupted, looking at her. Out there, Hermione. The use of her name was a shock, a sudden intimacy that made her breath hitch. Out there, I am Draco Malfoy, the boy who took the mark, the boy who let the Death Eaters into the school. I am a monster to be watched, a criminal to be managed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the glass dangling loosely from his fingers. The movement brought him into her space. The scent of him, rain, expensive soap, and the dark wine filled her senses. But here, he gestured vaguely to the shadowed walls. Here, I am just the latest disappointment in a long line of disappointments. The manor doesn't judge me for the war. It judges me for not polishing the silver. It judges me for letting the wards decay. It's a burden, yes, but it's my burden. It gives me a shape. He looked at her, his grey eyes piercing in the dim light. If I lose this house, I lose the context of who I am. I become just a memory of a war everyone wants to forget. I disappear. Hermione sat frozen. She understood him. God, she understood him. She thought of her own parents, their memories of her wiped clean. She thought of the empty space where her childhood should be. She thought of how the wizarding world called her a heroine, a statue, a symbol, but rarely asked Hermione how she was sleeping. I know what it's like, she whispered. To feel like you're fading, like you're just a character in a history book, not a real person. Draco tilted his head, studying her. You? The golden girl? The minister's favorite? The girl who was tortured on your floor. she said bluntly. Draco flinched. He looked down at his drink. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's part of the context, isn't it? She leaned forward too, mirroring his posture. The distance between their knees was negligible. I came here to take this place apart because I thought it would fix me. I thought if I mastered the manor, I would master the fear. Has it worked? No, she admitted. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. Draco looked up. The silence that stretched between them was thick, charged with a tension that was no longer hostile. It was magnetic. The storm raged outside, throwing itself against the walls, but in here the air was heavy with the heat of two bodies and the unspoken weight of survival. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. His gaze was tactile. It felt like a touch. You should be, he murmured. I'm not a good man, Granger. I never was. You're not a villain either, Draco. You're just broken, like the rest of us. Broken things have sharp edges. I have scars. I can handle edges. Draco let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh. He set his glass down on the floor. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them. For a moment, Hermione thought he would pull away, retreat back into his solitude. But he didn't. He reached toward her face. His fingers were trembling slightly. He brushed a loose curl of hair away from her forehead, tucking it behind her ear. His skin was rough, cold, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. Hermione stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should pull away. She should cite the regulations. She should remember who he was. But she didn't. She leaned into his hand, just a fraction of an inch. His thumb grazed her cheekbone. He traced the line of her jaw, his eyes following the movement with a reverent, starving intensity. It was as if he was memorizing her, trying to understand how something so warm could exist in his cold, dead world. You are so alive, he whispered, his voice rough. You burn so bright. It hurts to look at you. Then don't look, she breathed. I can't. He leaned in. The movement was slow, inevitable. Hermione watched his eyes flutter shut. She could feel his breath on her lips, warm, wine-scented. Her own eyelids felt heavy. The logic of the world, the laws of the ministry, the history of the war, it all dissolved in the golden candlelight. There was only him. There was only this room, this storm, and this man who looked at her as if she were the only light left in the universe. Her lips parted, a silent invitation. Draco's hand cupped the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her gently toward him. The anticipation was a physical ache, a tightening in her belly that demanded release. Boom! A thunderclap, louder than any before, shook the entire West Wing. The window pane nearest to them shattered inward, exploding in a shower of glass and rain. The wind howled into the room, extinguishing the candles instantly. The darkness slammed back down. Hermione gasped, jumping back, breaking the connection. The spell was broken. The cold, wet reality of the storm rushed in, chilling the heat that had just bloomed between them. "Reparo!" Draco shouted, his voice hard again, fighting the wind. But the magic didn't take. The mana was still draining everything. "Get down!" he yelled. He launched himself across the gap between them, not to kiss her, but to shield her. He tackled her off the chair, bearing her to the floor, covering her body with his own, as the wind whipped glass shards across the room. They lay there in the dark, on the Persian rug, his weight heavy and solid on top of her. His heart was pounding against her chest, fast, erratic, terrified. Or maybe that was her heart. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing ragged. "Are you hurt?" he demanded into her skin. "No," she gasped. "No, I'm fine." He didn't move. He stayed there for a long moment, holding her, his body pressing her into the floor. It was intimate in a way that the near kiss hadn't been. This was primal. This was protection. "Draco," she whispered. He pushed himself up on his arms, hovering over her in the blackness. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. "We need to move," he said, his voice clipped, detached. "The storm is getting worse. The cellar is safer." He scrambled off her, pulling her to her feet. His grip on her arm was tight, impersonal. He was back to being the soldier, the survivor. But as they stumbled through the dark corridor toward the stairs, Hermione could still feel the phantom heat of his thumb on her cheek and the ghostly pressure of his lips that had never quite landed. The storm had saved them from a mistake, or perhaps it had robbed them of a salvation. She didn't know which one terrified her more. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought exposure. After the chaos of the storm, the sky had cleared into a piercing, unforgiving blue. The light poured through the tall, arched windows of the manor, no longer filtered by rain or gloom. It was a harsh, interrogating light that illuminated every speck of dust, every crack in the plaster, and every mistake made in the darkness of the previous night. Hermione woke on the velvet sofa in the library, a transfigured blanket thrown haphazardly over her legs. Her neck was stiff, her mouth tasted of stale wine, and her head pounded with the dull rhythm of exhaustion. For a moment, in the hazy borderland between sleep and wakefulness, she felt a lingering sense of safety. She remembered the weight of a body pressing her into the floor, the smell of rain and cedar, the desperate, trembling hand on her cheek. Then she opened her eyes. The library was empty. The bottles were gone. The shattered glass from the window had been repaired, the pane looking as if it had never been broken. The fireplace was cold, the ash swept clean. It was as if the storm and the intimacy it had birthed had never happened. Hermione sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature settled in her stomach. She felt foolish, exposed. She had leaned in. She had let her guard down, let the lines blur, let herself believe that the desperate hunger in Draco Malfoy's eyes mirrored her own. She found him in the kitchen. It was a vast, sterile room of white marble and copper pots that hung from the ceiling like dormant bats. Draco stood by the massive slate sink, his back to her. He was no longer the disheveled, vulnerable boy from the candlelight. He was armored. His shirt was crisp, white, and buttoned to the throat. His hair was slicked back, severe and perfect. He was scrubbing a silver platter with a manic, rhythmic intensity, the muscles in his back tense under the fabric of his shirt. "Draco." He didn't turn. The scrubbing didn't pause. The sound of the stiff brush against the metal was grating, a harsh shh, shh, shh that filled the silence. "The structural damage to the West Wing is repaired," he said. His voice was unrecognizable. It was cool, smooth, and utterly devoid of inflection. It was the voice of the Malfoy heir addressing a servant. "I've recalibrated the wards. The inspection you missed yesterday has been rescheduled for noon. I trust you will be ready." Hermione stepped into the room, the sunlight hitting her face. She felt messy, human, and small against his glacial perfection. "Draco," she repeated, stepping closer. "About last night." The storm was severe. He cut her off, finally turning off the tap. He set the platter down on the drying rack with a metallic clang. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, focusing on a spot on the far wall. Adrenaline is a potent chemical. It induces irrational behavior. It's a biological response to danger, nothing more. "Nothing more?" Hermione felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. Not embarrassment, but anger. "You nearly kissed me. You told me." "I was drunk," he snapped. He turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes stopped her dead. The grey was hard, like flint. The vulnerability was gone, bricked up behind a wall so high she couldn't see the top of it. But beneath the coldness, she saw something else. Panic. A terrified, feral need to destroy whatever bridge they had built. "I was drunk on cheap wine and fear, Granger. Don't read poetry into a panic attack." "It wasn't just fear," Hermione said, her voice shaking slightly. She refused to retreat. She walked around the island, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. "You said you feel like you're disappearing. You said I made you feel—" "I said a lot of things," he sneered, leaning against the counter, crossing his arms. It was a defensive posture, a barrier. "I'm sure you found it all very touching. Another little broken thing for Hermione Granger to fix. Another cause to champion." The words landed like a slap. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Isn't it?" Draco pushed off the counter, stalking towards her. He moved with a predatory grace, using his height to intimidate. "Look at you. You're beaming with it. The savior complex. You think because you have the deed to my house, you have the deed to my soul? You think if you polish me up, put me on the right shelf, I'll be a good little citizen?" "I don't think that." "You do," he hissed, looming over her. "You look at me, and you see a project. You see a redemption arc. But here's the reality, Granger. I am not Ron Weasley. I am not some stray dog you can feed and domesticate." Hermione took a step back, hurt flashing in her eyes. He saw it. He saw the wound he had inflicted, and for a split second he faltered. His mask slipped, revealing a flash of agonizing guilt. But then he doubled down, grabbing the knife and twisting it deeper, because he knew it was the only way to make her stop looking at him with that dangerous, terrifying hope. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "You walk through these halls pretending to be the mistress, but the manor knows. The portraits know. You're a tourist in a graveyard." "I am the owner," she said, her voice trembling but hard. "You own the stone," he spat. "You will never own the history. You will never understand what it means to be a Malfoy. You think you can just love the darkness out of this place? Out of me?" He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You're arrogant, Granger, and you're naive." He was close enough now that she could see the faint tremor in his jaw. He was shaking. He was terrifyingly beautiful and utterly cruel, and she realized with a sinking heart that he was doing this on purpose. He was burning the world so he wouldn't have to live in it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Why are you pushing me away?" "Because I don't want you here," he shouted, the control finally snapping. "I don't want your pity. I don't want your kindness. Every time you look at me with those big, forgiving eyes, it makes me sick." It reminds me of everything I'm not, everything I can never be. He slammed his hand onto the marble countertop. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the large kitchen. "Go do your inventory, Granger," he breathed, turning his back on her, his shoulders heaving. "Go count your spoons. Go write your reports. Just leave me alone." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the wreckage of the moment. The sunlight seemed to mock them, bright and unyielding. Hermione stood there for a long time. She looked at his back, the rigid line of his spine, the tension that held him together. She wanted to reach out. She wanted to tell him that she didn't see a project. She saw a man who was drowning. But she knew he wouldn't take the hand. He would bite it. Something in her chest closed. A door that had been creaking open for days slammed shut and locked. She straightened her spine. She smoothed the wrinkles in her robes. She raised her chin, pulling the mask of the ministry official back over her face. It was heavy, cold, and familiar. "Very well, Mr. Malfoy," she said. Her voice was ice. It was professional, distant, and utterly hollow. Draco flinched at the tone. His head dipped slightly, as if he had been struck, but he didn't turn around. "The inspection is at noon," Hermione continued, her voice devoid of emotion. "I expect the library to be fully categorized by then. I will be in the study. Do not disturb me unless the house is burning down." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and walked out of the kitchen. Her footsteps clicked rhythmically on the stone floor, a sound of retreat and authority. She didn't look back. If she had, she might have seen Draco Malfoy grip the edge of the sink until his knuckles turned white. She might have seen him bow his head, his forehead resting against the cold marble, his eyes squeezing shut against the sudden, burning sting of tears he refused to shed. She walked through the hallway, past the portraits that sneered at her, past the shadows that seemed to lengthen despite the noon sun. She went to the study and closed the door. She sat behind the massive desk that had once belonged to Lucius Malfoy. She pulled a fresh piece of parchment toward her and dipped her quill in ink. She tried to write, "Inventory Report, Day 4. The ink dripped from her quill, forming a dark, spreading blot on the paper. She stared at it. It looked like a black hole. She wasn't crying. She was too angry to cry. She was too hurt. But mostly, she was cold. The warmth of the previous night, the shared wine, the shared fear, the almost kiss, felt like a hallucination. Draco was right. They were enemies. They were oil and water. They were the victor and the vanquished, and no amount of candlelight could bridge the abyss of blood and history between them. He wanted a war? Fine. Hermione vanished the ink blot with a sharp flick of her wand. She dipped the quill again. Her hand was steady. Subject, Draco Malfoy. Status, non-compliant, hostile. She wrote the words, and they felt like a betrayal, but they also felt like armor. And right now, alone in the enemy's castle, armor was the only thing she had left. The silence in Malfoy Manor had lasted for 3 days. It was not the peaceful silence of a library, nor the companionable silence they had briefly shared during the storm. It was a suffocating, pressurized silence, thick with unsaid words and resentment that tasted like copper in the back of the throat. Hermione moved through the house like a phantom, her footsteps echoing sharply on the stone, executing her duties with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. She had retreated fully into the role of the bureaucrat. She wore her hair in a tight, punishing knot. She spoke only when necessary, and even then, her voice was a flat, monochromatic drone that infuriated Draco more than her screaming ever could. She was erasing him. Not with magic, but with indifference. On the fourth morning, the silence broke. It happened in the East Gallery, a long, narrow corridor lined with the portraits of Malfoys who had died in disgraced circumstances. At the far end of the hall, dominating the wall, was a massive fresco painted directly onto the plaster. It was a masterpiece of technique and a horror of subject matter. Painted in the 17th century, it depicted Abraxas the Cruel standing triumphantly over a cowering group of muggles, his wand raised, green light spilling from the tip to illuminate their terrified faces. It was hateful, it was grotesque, and it was item number 1 on Hermione's demolition list for the day. She stood before it, her wand raised, the tip glowing with a pulsating white light. Beside her, a magical construction crew, 2 floating spectral hammers and a bucket of dissolving solvent waited for her command. "Diffindo," she whispered, aiming at the edge of the plaster. "Don't." The word was not shouted, but it carried enough force to stop her hand in mid-air. Hermione didn't turn. She knew he was there. She had felt his presence the moment he entered the gallery, a sudden drop in temperature, a prickling on the back of her neck. "It's a Class A hate object, Malfoy," she said to the wall. "It violates the Moral Standards Act of 1999. It depicts the torture of muggles as heroic. It goes." "It is a fresco." Draco's voice came closer. He sounded ragged. "Painted by Venetian wizards. You can't just blast it off the wall like it's common graffiti. Watch me." She tightened her grip on her wand. "I said, don't." Draco moved. He didn't use magic. He used his body. He stepped directly between her and the wall, placing himself in the line of fire. His chest heaved, colliding with the tip of her wand. If she had cast the spell, it would have sliced him open. Hermione jerked her hand back, the white light of her wand extinguishing with a hiss. "Are you insane?" she yelled, the professional mask finally cracking. "Move out of the way." "No." Draco stood his ground. He looked like a wreck. He hadn't shaved in the 3 days since their fight in the kitchen. A shadow of blonde stubble covered his jaw. His shirt was wrinkled, the top buttons undone, and his eyes were rimmed with red, burning with a frantic, desperate light. He looked like a man who had been awake for 70 hours staring at the ceiling. "You are not destroying this," he breathed, his voice shaking. "Why?" Hermione demanded, stepping forward until she was toe-to-toe with him. The anger she had been bottling up, the hurt from his rejection, the humiliation of her own vulnerability, surged to the surface. "Why do you defend it? Look at it, Draco. It's a celebration of murder. Is this who you are? Is this what you want to preserve?" "It's not about what it depicts," he roared back, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "It's about the fact that it's here. It's part of the house. The house is mine, but the memories are mine." He grabbed her wrist. It was a shock of contact, hot, hard, desperate. He didn't hurt her, but he held her with a strength that pinned her in place. "You come in here," he hissed, leaning down, his face inches from hers. "You walk through my life with your checklist and your moral superiority. You label everything. This is dark, this is dangerous, this is trash, and you just erase it. You think if you scrub the walls white, the blood underneath disappears? You think if you burn the books, the knowledge vanishes? I am trying to make this place livable," Hermione shouted, wrenching her arm, but he didn't let go. I am trying to make it so I can walk down a hallway without seeing people being tortured. I am trying to make it so you don't have to live in a shrine to your own worst mistakes. I am my worst mistakes, Draco yelled. That's what you don't get, Granger. You can't renovate me. You can't sand down my edges and paint me gold and pretend I'm a Gryffindor. This wall, that ugliness, that is my blood. That is my history. And every time you destroy a piece of it, you are destroying a piece of me. Then maybe you need to be destroyed. The words hung in the air, terrible and final. Hermione gasped, shocked by her own cruelty. The silence rushed back in, deafening this time. Draco's face went deadly pale. His grip on her wrist loosened, but he didn't let go. He looked at her with a devastation so profound it felt like a physical blow. "Is that what you want?" he whispered. His voice broke. "You want to finish what the war started? You want to wipe the Malfoys off the map?" "No," Hermione breathed, her eyes filling with sudden hot tears. "No, Draco, that's not... I didn't mean..." "You did," he said. He pulled her closer, abruptly, roughly. There was no gentleness left in him. He was a cornered animal lashing out with everything he had. "You hate me. You hate this place. You hate that you're stuck here with the wreckage." "I don't hate you," she cried, her hands flying up to push against his chest. But instead, her fingers curled into his shirt. "I hate that you won't let it go. I hate that you're drowning and you won't let me help you. I hate that I look at you and I see the boy who made the wrong choice, and I see the man who could be so much more, and I can't stand the waste of it." "There is no more," Draco snarled. "This is it. This is all there is. Just a man in a dead house." "You are not dead." "Then make me feel it." The challenge was a scream. It was a plea. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his grey eyes wild and starving. The distance between them vanished. The air in the gallery became static, charged with so much magic and rage and suppressed desire that it felt like the storm had returned. But this time, it was inside them. Hermione looked at him, at the fury, the pain, the arrogance, the beautiful, broken mess of him. And something in her snapped. The logic, the rules, the ministry protocols, they all incinerated. She didn't think. She surged forward. She grabbed the lapels of his shirt and yanked him down. Draco met her halfway. The kiss was a collision. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't romantic. It was violent. It was the crash of two planets that had been orbiting each other in a decaying spiral for years. Draco groaned, a low, guttural sound in his throat, and his arms wrapped around her waist, crushing her against him. He lifted her, his hands desperate, possessive, digging into the fabric of her robes as if he were trying to merge their bodies into one. Hermione's wand clattered to the floor, forgotten. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling his head closer, deeper. She kissed him with all the frustration of the last week, all the anger of the last 10 years. She tasted coffee and despair and fire. He tasted like a storm. He backed her up, his movements rough, uncoordinated. Her back hit the opposite wall, the empty wall, hard enough to knock the breath out of her, but she didn't care. She welcomed the pain. It was real. It was grounding. Draco pressed his hips against hers, pinning her to the stone. He devoured her mouth, biting her lower lip, his tongue sweeping into her mouth with a hunger that terrified and thrilled her. He kissed her like a dying man drinking water. He kissed her like he wanted to consume her light to fill his own darkness. Hermione, he gasped against her mouth, breaking the kiss for a fraction of a second to breathe. The name was a prayer and a curse. "Shut up," she sobbed, pulling him back down. She kissed his jaw, his neck, feeling the frantic pulse beating under his skin. She felt his hands roaming over her back, her waist, sliding up to cup her face, his thumbs bruising her cheekbones. His touch was fire. It burned through the layers of her robes, branding her. This wasn't just physical. It was a conversation they had been having for 7 years, finally spoken in the only language that mattered. It was the hate turning inside out. It was the tension snapping. It was the realization that the line between "I want to kill you" and "I want to die in your arms" was razor thin. Draco pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. They were both gasping for air, their chests heaving in unison. His eyes were closed, his lashes wet. "You can't," he whispered, his voice wrecked. "You can't fix this." "I'm not trying to fix it," Hermione whispered back, her hands still clutching his shirt, holding him up as much as he was holding her. I'm here. Draco, I'm here." He opened his eyes. The grey was dark, dilated, blown wide open. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. "Why?" he asked again, the eternal question. "Because," she said, tracing the sharp line of his jaw with a trembling finger. "Because I'm the only one who knows the ghosts." Draco let out a shuddering breath. He leaned into her touch, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. It was a gesture of surrender. The fight had gone out of him, leaving only the raw, exposed nerve of the man beneath. He looked over her shoulder at the mural on the opposite wall. The image of Abraxas Malfoy sneered down at them, wand raised in hate. Draco looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at Hermione. "Burn it," he said hoarsely. Hermione blinked, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "What?" "The fresco," Draco said. He didn't look away from her eyes. "Burn it. Blast it. I don't care." "But you said it's your history." "It was," he whispered. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her temple, his arms tightening around her waist, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "But I think I'd rather look at you." He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply, hiding from the light, hiding from the ancestors. Hermione stood there, pressed against the cold stone, holding the air of Malfoy Manor in her arms. Her wand lay on the floor. The wall of hate loomed behind them. But for the first time since she had arrived at the gates, the manor didn't feel like a graveyard. It felt like a battlefield where the war had finally, abruptly stopped. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, holding him tight. "Okay," she whispered into his hair. "Okay." The wall in the east gallery was white. It was a stark, blinding white, the fresh plaster smelling of wet chalk and lime, standing out like a bandage against the aged, dark stone of the surrounding corridor. The fresco of Abraxas Malfoy was gone. There was no green light, no cowering figures, no celebration of cruelty, just a blank space, a tabula rasa. Hermione stood before it, her hands clasped behind her back. It was early morning, a week after the incident in the gallery. The air in the manor had changed. The oppressive weight that used to press against the eardrums had lifted, replaced by a strange, tentative stillness. It was the silence of a battlefield after the treaties have been signed, but before the dead have been buried. It looks naked. The voice came from behind her. It didn't startle her anymore. She had learned the rhythm of his footsteps, light, hesitant, always stopping just on the edge of her personal space. Hermione turned. Draco was standing a few feet away, leaning against a pillar. He looked better. The feral desperation of the previous week had receded, replaced by a quiet, watchful weariness. He was shaved. His clothes were immaculate again, but he wore them differently. They were no longer armor. They were just clothes. "It looks like potential," Hermione corrected him softly. "We can paint something else, or leave it, a pause in the history." Draco looked at the white patch. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was not clenched. "A pause," he repeated. "The Malfoys aren't known for pauses. We prefer grand statements." "Grand statements are exhausting, Draco." "Yes," he admitted, his eyes flickering to hers. "They are." He held a silver tray in his hands. On it sat a porcelain teapot and 2 cups. The domesticity of the gesture still felt jarring, a surreal overlay on the dark history of the house, but it was becoming a ritual. Every morning at 8 a.m. Tea, no insults, just existence. "Breakfast is in the solarium," he said, "unless you prefer to stare at drying plaster all morning." "I have work to do," Hermione said, but she moved away from the wall, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the sunlit wing of the house. "The inventory is finished," Draco noted, looking straight ahead. "The boxes are sealed. The dark artifacts are in the vault. The ministry van arrives at noon to collect the confiscations." "Yes." "So," he paused, and for the first time his step faltered. He corrected it instantly, but Hermione saw the hesitation. "So, your work here is done." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of resignation. He was preparing for the end. He was steeling himself for the moment she would pack her beaded bag, lock the gates, and leave him alone in the silence he hated. Hermione didn't answer immediately. She waited until they reached the solarium. It was a beautiful room, walls of glass looking out over the overgrown rose gardens. The sunlight was warm here, smelling of earth and late summer blooms. She sat at the small iron table. Draco placed the tray down and poured the tea. His hands were steady, but his eyes refused to meet hers. He was retreating. He was pulling the bricks back up, preparing to be the ghost again. "Sit down, Draco," she said. He hesitated, his hand lingering on the back of the chair opposite her. "I have to supervise the house elves in the kitchen. They get anxious when—" "Sit." It was the same tone she had used with Inspector Pringle, firm, unyielding. Draco sat. He took his cup, holding it like a lifeline, staring into the dark liquid. Hermione reached into her robe pocket. She pulled out a roll of parchment. It wasn't the ministry checklist. It was a heavy, cream-colored document, sealed with her own wax, not the official crimson stamp. She slid it across the table. It stopped against his saucer with a soft tap. Draco looked at it. He didn't touch it. "What is this?" "The eviction notice." "Read it." He set his cup down. His long fingers reached out, hovering over the paper for a second before breaking the seal. He unrolled it slowly, his eyes scanning the dense legal script. Hermione watched him. She saw his eyes narrow. She saw his lips part slightly. She saw the moment the words registered. Clause 14b. Permanent residency and custodianship. Hereby grants Draco Lucius Malfoy lifelong rights of residency within the confines of Malfoy Manor, appointed as sole custodian of the historical archives and structural integrity. Ownership title remains with Hermione J. Granger, with shared executive authority regarding renovation and preservation. Draco stopped reading. He stared at the paper for a long time. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the distant call of a peacock in the garden. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, not with tears that would fall, but with a glassy, shocked sheen. He looked furious and terrified and relieved all at once. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I can," Hermione said calmly. "I'm the owner. I checked the Reparations Act. Subsection 4 allow the owner to appoint a custodian if the property requires specialized magical knowledge to maintain. You are the only one who knows how the wards breathe, Draco. You are the only one who knows which floorboards scream. This is charity," he hissed, pushing the parchment back toward her. "I don't want your pity, Granger. I told you." "It's not charity," she countered, leaning forward, her voice fierce. "It's a job, and it's a sentence. You don't get to leave, Draco. You don't get to run away from what your family did. You have to stay here and help me fix it. You have to live in the house you helped break, and you have to help me put it back together." "Why?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why would you want that? Why would you want me here?" "Because," Hermione said, her voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. "Because the house is too big for one person. And because I don't want to be here alone either." The admission hung in the air between them. Draco looked at her, searching her face for the lie, for the trick. He looked at the scar on her neck, the determination in her jaw, the softness in her brown eyes. "You're staying?" he asked quietly. "It's my house," she shrugged, a small, nervous smile touching her lips. "I can't very well run it from a flat in London. The library alone will take years to properly catalogue. And the garden is a disaster. And someone has to make sure you don't paint Abraxas back on the wall." Draco let out a breath, a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to empty his lungs of years of held breath. He slumped back in his chair, the tension draining out of his shoulders. "You are infuriating," he muttered. "You are completely, utterly impossible." "I've been told," she replied. "Do you accept the terms?" Draco looked at the parchment again. Sole custodian. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. It was a purpose. It was a reason to wake up in the morning. It was a way to exist in the world that didn't involve hiding or dying. He picked up the quill that lay on the table. He didn't look at her as he signed his name at the bottom. The scratch of the nib was loud in the quiet room. Draco L. Malfoy. He rolled the parchment back up and pushed it to the center of the table. "There," he said, his voice rough. "You have your custodian." "Good," Hermione said. She didn't take the parchment. She just looked at him. The silence returned, but it had changed again. It was no longer the silence of a ceasefire. It was the silence of a beginning. Draco picked up his tea. His hand was shaking just slightly. He took a sip, then set it down. He looked out the window at the wild, overgrown garden. "The roses need pruning," he said, his voice casual, though the pulse in his neck betrayed him. "They're choking the hydrangeas. If we don't cut them back before the frost, the roots will rot. If we don't..." Hermione felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the sunlight. "Then we should start there," she said, "after the ministry van leaves." I suppose, Draco drawled, regaining a sliver of his old protective haughtiness. Though I doubt you know the difference between a pruning shear and a hex. I learned quickly. We'll see. He turned his gaze from the window to her. The grey eyes were clear. The shadows were still there. They would always be there. But the drowning look was gone. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying clarity. He looked at her not as an enemy, not as a saviour, but as the woman who had walked into his hell and decided to furnish it. He reached across the table. Hermione's breath hitched. He didn't take her hand. He simply placed his hand on the table, palm up. An open gesture, a question. Hermione looked at his hand. The pale skin, the long fingers, the faint tremor. It was the hand that had let Death Eaters into Hogwarts. It was the hand that had lowered a wand rather than killed Dumbledore. It was the hand that had held her in the dark while the storm raged. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. His grip was firm, cool, and grounding. He didn't pull her closer. He didn't smile. He just held on, anchoring himself to the earth, anchoring himself to her. The van arrives at noon, he repeated softly. I know, she whispered. We have time. Yes, Hermione said, squeezing his hand back. We have time. Draco looked at their joined hands, then back up at her eyes. A corner of his mouth quirked up, not a smirk, but a genuine, weary, beautiful smile. Welcome home, Granger, he said. And for the first time since she had arrived at the iron gates in the rain, Hermione believed him. The war was over. The renovation had begun.
Hello everyone, thank you for listening this story with me. I wanted to write about something real. We all know Draco and Hermione are enemies, but I think they are also very similar. They are both tired of the war. They are both lonely. Draco is broken inside. He lives in the past. Hermione tries to fix everything with rules. But you cannot fix a broken heart with magic. You can only fix it with time and with trust. In this story, the manor is not just a house, it is like their relationship. It has dark corners, it has bad memories, but if you open windows, the light comes in. The ending is not a fairy tale, it is not perfect, but is honest. Love is not always easy. Sometimes love is just choosing to stay and fix the broken thing together. I hope this story touched your heart. Thank you for listening.